Hello there. I'm just going to carry on reading from Rachel Aviv's article in the New Yorker. And we've come to the part here where she starts talking about a third so-called insulin case that Evans discovers, but that doesn't make it to the indictment list, the list of indictments. So I'll just read this little bit here. Among the new suspicious episodes that Evans said he flagged, now just to cut in, these 25 so-called suspicious incidents of the second batch of 28 sets of notes that Evans was sent from the hospital or via the police, from the hospital via the police. We don't know why they were sent, who chose them, on what basis they were chosen, but nonetheless he chose 25 as suspicious out of a batch of 28, which is an extraordinary concentration considering the first batch he was sent he chose less than 50%, but here he's almost getting towards 100% of them are suspicious. So the more he's looking, the more suspicious they're becoming, but nonetheless, I know I've interrupted this already. But I've just got to say this as I go along. The further he's going, the more concentration there is of suspiciousness, if you see what I mean. So he's almost up to 100% now. But the irony is that this intense level of suspicion of nearly everything he's sent in the second batch, none of them go anywhere. None of them are followed up by the police. None of them are part of the indictment. It just doesn't make any sense. None of it makes any sense. None of it makes any sense. Because none of it's true. Anyway, I'll start again. Among the new suspicious episodes that Evans said he flagged was another insulin case. Evans said that it had similar features as the first two, high insulin and low C-peptide. We're going to come back to that statement from a different article. He concluded that it was a clear case of poisoning. When I asked Michael Hall, I being Rachel Aviv, when I asked Michael Hall, a retired neonatologist at University Hospital, Southampton, who worked as an expert for Lucy Letby's defence, about Evans's third insulin case, he was surprised and disturbed to learn of it. He could imagine a few reasons that it might not have been part of the trial. One is that Lucy Letby wasn't working at the time. Possibly. Another is that there was an alternative explanation for the test results. But then, presumably, such an explanation could be relevant for the other two insulin cases too, i.e. that they're just not reliable results. I've added that bit in, that they're not reliable. Quote, whichever way you look at this, that third case is of interest, close quote, Hall told me. So that's the expert that the defence had, but they never called him. Going on with Rachel Aviv's article here, Ton Dirksen, in his book about Lucia de Burgh, that's the Dutch nurse, who was wrongly convicted and then had her conviction overturned, very much with the help of Richard Gill, used the analogy of a train. The locomotives, in quotes, were two cases in which there had been allegations of poisoning. Another 8 cases involving children who suddenly became ill on de Burgh's shifts were the wagons trailing along because of a belief that all the deaths couldn't have occurred by chance. That's interesting in a way. I just want to make a comment on that I don't know in that case of the Lucia de Burgh, did they, quote unquote, find the poisonings, the allegations of poisonings, which obviously weren't poisonings, but the presumption of poisonings. Did they find them first, and they're calling that the locomotive? If that is the case, that's the opposite of what's happened in the Lucy Letby miscarriage of justice, is that they established the wagons, which are these so-called air embolism cases and trauma and overfeeding. They established the wagons first. And then they realise they've just got a bunch of wagons that aren't going anywhere, if that's the case. I mean, I know that's the way round it was in the Lucy Letby case. I don't know what it was in the Lucia de Burgh, but presumably the way it's been described there, with this analogy of the locomotives are the alleged poisonings. But in the Lucy Letby case, they've got the wagons of all these air embolism cases, so-called. They're not going to go anywhere on their own, the wagons, so they have to find a locomotive from somewhere a year later. And Breary finds the two of them, and apparently here Evans finds the third one, but that goes nowhere because of one of the two reasons that Mr. Hall, what's his name? Michael Hall, mentions it's one or two, and either direction isn't good in terms of the reliability of those tests, or the reliability of the accusation of poisoning. So if Lucy Letby's not on duty, obviously she couldn't have done it. And if the test is simply not reliable, then it hasn't happened at all. It could be the case that Lucy Letby, well, I think it is the case that Lucy Letby, well, I don't know if it's the case she wasn't on duty, we don't know. We're not being told that. But let's say she wasn't on duty. It could be that she's not on duty, therefore it can't be her, but also that it hasn't happened as well, i.e. that those tests are completely unreliable. We'll talk more about the tests in a bit later on, when I go to the other article. So, anyway, go back to this guy, Ton Berkson, talking about Lucia de Burgh. So another 8 cases involving children. These were the wagons, trailing along because of a belief that all the deaths couldn't have occurred by chance. The locomotives in the Lucy Letby prosecution were the insulin cases. I've got to slow down, speaking too quickly. But as I just said, they got the locomotives after the wagons, didn't they? Which is an odd thing to do, but anyway, which were charged as attempted murders, even though those two babies didn't suffer any particular harm at all, actually, and one left the next day. Anyway, we'll come to that. Quote, the fact that there were 2 deliberate poisonings with insulin, Nick Johnson, the prosecutor, said, quote again, will help you, we're talking to the jury here, will help you when you are assessing whether the collapses and deaths of other children of the neonatal unit were because somebody was sabotaging them, or whether these were just tragic coincidences. See, there's a lot in that, what he's saying there. There's an admission there, there's a sort of barely buried admission there, that all those other ones, in and of themselves, of course they could be just tragic coincidences, i.e. that there was no intended harm. He's acknowledging that there as a possibility, but he's saying, but if you bolt all that on to these so-called smoking gun cases, then you can beef those up, can't you, into them, and tip them over into thinking, oh, well, they can't be tragic coincidences. But there's an admission there in his question, in his statement, the prosecutor, in that absent these 2 so-called smoking gun cases, well, all the rest of them could have very easily have been acknowledged as tragic coincidences. Why should that then change in and of itself? Only gets changed because it gets harnessed to this locomotive of the 2 insulin cases found after the wagons have been established. The wagons of these cases which prosecutor acknowledges as himself are likely to be, or certainly may be, tragic coincidences. And I believe, and many other people, more and more people believing that that's exactly what they are. I've never believed anything else. But it's just this sleight of hand that this so-called justice system can have somebody making a statement like that to manipulate the jury into saying, well, you might think all those there's nothing in any of those, but if you believe these, you kind of have to believe all the other ones. Or It's what I've said in previous videos. Both sections of these, I've put it that these two sections, the so-called insulin cases and all the other ones, in and of themselves are completely weak. Had none of the other ones been brought and only these two so-called insulin cases been brought, I don't think they would have got to trial at all. And that's the irony here, that they would not have got through the system. They wouldn't have been prosecuted, wouldn't have been prosecutable. And yet they're the locomotive. They become the locomotive. Something that couldn't stand alone. I said this in previous videos. And then there's a buried admission here, even by the prosecutor, saying that the other ones clearly couldn't stand alone unless you had this allegedly convincing locomotive to get them to start moving along the track. I don't know if I'll carry on with this analogy of the locomotives, but it's quite useful. I understand it, but it's just a curiosity that perhaps in contrast to the Lucia de Burke case, they found the wagons and then they were looking for a locomotive to get them moving in that order. So carry on back to Rachel Aviv's article. But not only were the circumstances of the poisoning speculative, they certainly were, the results were too. If the aim was to kill, neither child came close to the intended consequences, no. And they weren't even designated crashes. The reason why we know that is because allegedly the consultants, or the hospital, whoever was in charge of deciding which so-called cases to send to Evans, whether it was Breary or whether it was the combination of all these consultants or a mixture of people did it, from other people that we don't know their names of, looking through 18 months of notes and deciding, oh, is this a crash? Was that a crash? They didn't even, these two so-called insulin smoking gun cases didn't even raise to the level of a crash or sudden health deterioration. And yet they become attempted murders. It doesn't make any sense at all. Had they been that serious at the time, and this is another issue, isn't it? Had they been that serious at the time, as opposed to a fluctuation of, controlling the glucose and insulin levels and of the two babies, or their other markers, in terms of during their stay at the hospital there, then that would have been they certainly would have investigated that, wouldn't they? They would have double checked on these blood results, but they just lay there doing nothing for a year until somebody went on the hunt for them. But it didn't flag up anybody's concern at the time. You've got to wonder why. I think the principal reason they didn't flag up any major concern is because those babies weren't particularly affected. I'll carry on with this a minute. So if the aim was to kill, neither child came close to the intended consequences. The first baby recovered after a day. The second showed no symptoms. And was discharged in good health. And those are two attempted murders. So you attempt to murder two babies. One recovers after a day. And the second time, there's much more to say about this in terms of the actual alleged readings, on these blood tests. The second shows no symptoms. You attempt to murder a baby by poisoning the baby with insulin, a tiny baby, and there's no symptoms, and it's attempted murder, and the baby's discharged in good health. Does that make sense? Of course it doesn't. On the first day of the trial, am I going to stop it there? Yeah, I'm going to stop it there because I'm going to go to, they're moving on to a different subject in the Rachel Aviv one. So that's where I'm going to leave off the Rachel Aviv one here, but I'm just going to go to some other articles that I've pulled up here. I'll put a link to these two in the bar below. And this is from the, what's the date of this? I need to look at the date of this, sorry. Go to the top of this here. The 9th of July. I didn't think it was that far back. 9th of July. The last couple of weeks have gone very, very quickly. And it's an article in the Telegraph, and I'll put the link below. It's from an archive, so you don't have to, you don't have to be a member of the Telegraph Readers Association or anything. You can read this free in the archive. I'm looking here for the part here about... where is it? There's a section called A Strange Drop in Blood Sugar. A strange drop in blood sugar. And this is in this Telegraph article from the 9th of July. I'll just read that now, because it relates to what we were looking at, talking about in the Rachel Aviv article. Lucy Letby was accused of attempting to murder 2 babies by poisoning liquid nutrition bags with insulin. There was no direct evidence that the bags had been tampered with. See, the bags were never tested. Nobody ever tested the bags. Nobody ever found insulin anywhere. It's all to do with these blood tests found a year later and whether they're reliable or not. Nobody's ever found any insulin in any TPN bags that shouldn't have been there. Bags have been thrown away long, long time ago. Never were tested. There was never any proof there was any insulin in those bags whatsoever. It's never been proven. It's all by inference based on these blood tests, which clearly are not reliable for various reasons, as we'll go on to talk about. There was no direct evidence that the bags had been tampered with, as tests were never carried out on the contents. Well, not only on the contents, but also not on the bags themselves. And the prosecution instead relied on blood samples from the babies. Okay, this is the Telegraph article I'm reading now. Insulin regulates blood sugar, and too much can cause blood sugar levels to crash dangerously, a condition known as hypoglycemia. Hypo, that's the low blood sugar, and hypo is the high, isn't it? I have to keep reminding myself of that. So a condition known as hypoglycemia, that's the very low blood sugar, which can be life-threatening. In the first case, baby F had suffered an unexpected drop in blood sugar together with a surge in heart rate in the early hours of August the 5th, 2015, when Lucy Letby was on shift. It was the prosecution's case that Lucy Letby had deliberately injected insulin into the bag. Baby F's low blood sugar continued even when Lucy Letby was not on the ward, and the prosecution claimed that she had also put insulin in a bag in the fridge, which had then been selected by other nurses. So she's, as I think Maya's made the point, she's got this gift of second sight to know which bag they were going to choose. I mean, it's just desperate. So as soon as she goes off duty, it's carrying on. So they've got to say, well, she obviously did more of them. There's no evidence for it at all. There's no evidence of it, but they've got to keep extending the range of their supposition and to make it fit. It has to be made to fit. It has to be made to cobble together. If this is a locomotive, it's falling apart. The engine's falling apart. It's a train wreck of a locomotive. It's a write-off, like a write-off. So, yeah, she'd done that, and she had the foresight to know which one they were going to pick. I think they've even said in other places, she did several of them, and to make the chances higher. But there's never any evidence for that, It's just bizarre. Just to repeat, no one's ever tested a TPN bag that Lucy Letby was ever involved in or said to have been involved in and found insulin in it. It's all by inference. False inference, clearly. Blood tests from baby F showed high levels of insulin. Well, that's not necessarily true. This is what I'm going to go into later. Showed high levels. It shows something else, which suggests that there may be high levels of insulin, yet low levels of another hormone called C-peptide. C-peptide is produced alongside insulin in the body, so that if there is none present, that suggests the insulin present has not been made in the body and must have come from outside, also called synthetic insulin or exogenous insulin. That's the stuff from outside. And then it's got this little diagram here, which is quite useful to look at. And it goes on, a second baby, baby L, also suffered an alarming dip in glucose levels on April the 8th, 2016. And again, just to repeat, as I said before, but it didn't warrant being marked up as a crash, so-called crash, because both in the original sets of 33 notes sent to Evans, and then the next batch of 28, these cases weren't part of them. These two cases weren't part of them. Well, I'm assuming they weren't, because it's only recently I found out about these 28 cases that were sent. But if Evans has found this third case, which never gets progressed, because none of the 25 he chooses gets progressed. I've got it, because we're told that he's sent a second batch. I know we have to take all this stuff on faith, but this is what we're told. He's sent a second batch of 28, out of which he chooses 25, and none of them are progressed. So those 25 cannot include the two so-called smoking gun insulin cases that end up on the indictment. They can't, because none of them are progressed. That's what it says in the other article. None of them. So the third insulin case that he finds is in addition to the two that Breary finds that do end up on the indictment. This third one doesn't, because of what Michael Hall says. Either Lucy Letby isn't on duty, which is damning in and of itself, and the other way it's damning is that whether she's on duty or not is because there's something wrong with the test results, and therefore one could infer there's something wrong with all these test results for a whole host of reasons. Where was I on this one? A second baby, baby L, also suffered an alarming dip in glucose levels in April the 8th, 2016. So there's a really big gap between, as other people have said right from the beginning, serial killers choosing different modus operandi, so-called, and this is August, September, October, a 10-month gap, 9-month gap between these alleged poisonings. Nothing makes sense. And they're just trying all these different techniques in between, when, if you're to believe the serial killer story, which is always complete rubbish, Lucy Letby was an incredibly quote-unquote successful serial killer in the first, in a less than about a 10-day period in June 2015. And then she's got a technique which works very quickly, and then she goes on to other techniques which don't work, which never work, which she goes on to techniques of trying to kill babies, of trying to murder babies. This is all inverted commas, this is all in quotes. I'm not saying this is what happened. She goes on to, this is what we're expected to believe. She goes on to choose techniques to murder babies, attempt to murder them, in which there's no symptoms, and the baby leaves hospital the next day. It doesn't make any sense. Please. It's just staggering how it ever... Well, there we are. This is what the system we're dealing with. This is how bad it is. This is how bad it is. It knows how bad it is, and this is why it's going to resist kicking and screaming to turn this miscarriage of justice around, because it knows it will reveal how absolutely, horribly, horribly bad, wicked, sinister, evil, what a wreck it is, what an absolute wreck, what a disaster it is, the criminal justice system. Back to this article from the Telegraph. However, Professor Joseph Wolfsdorf, good name, Wolfsdorf, a specialist in child hypoglycemia at Harvard Medical School, no slouch obviously, said the results, quote unquote, made no sense, the results, that's these blood tests. And he goes on to say in a quote, when serum insulin is extremely high, caused by injection, so exogenous synthetic insulin, the beta cells of the pancreas stop secreting insulin. So human insulin you stop making it. And at the same time, they stop making C-peptide. One expects, therefore, he goes on to say, or Professor Wolfsdorf, one expects, therefore, to have extremely low or unmeasurable serum C-peptide concentration. This is the bit that's interesting. I want to contrast it with what Evans says to Rachel Aviv now. Professor Wolfsdorf goes on to say, in one of the babies, serum insulin was extremely high, i.e. the alleged external given insulin, and yet C-peptide was within the reference range, i.e. not extremely low or unmeasurable. Not extremely low or unmeasurable. Therefore, he goes on to say, one has to be highly suspicious that the high insulin level was caused by exogenous, i.e. external synthetic administration. If the sample was obtained at the time plasma glucose was low, hypoglycemia, a C-peptide concentration within the reference range makes no sense. In other words, because they could measure it and it was within this range, it should have been zero. With that amount of apparent or asserted insulin being given externally, exogenously, synthetically, all meaning the same thing, there should have been almost a zero, extremely low or unmeasurable C-peptide. But when we go back now to the, just take a second to go back to the, what does Evans say here? I'll read it again. Among the new suspicious episodes, this is Rachel Aviv's article now again. Among the new suspicious episodes that Evans said he flagged was another insulin case. Evans said, this is the bit, Evans said that it had similar features as the first two, high insulin and low C-peptide. But Professor Wolfsdorf is saying here, well, it's not matching that. The C-peptide is way too high in relation to the alleged amount of insulin that's been given. It should be extremely low or immeasurable. You can see how random Evans is. He's even got that wrong, hasn't he? He's got that wrong, as we see from what Professor Wolfsdorf is saying. I need to find that article again. Where was I? So I hope that makes sense. I'm going to put a link to the Telegraph archived article so you can read it. You don't have to buy the Telegraph. Okay, so he says, therefore one has to be highly suspicious that the high insulin level was caused by exogenous administration. The C-peptide concentration within the reference range makes no sense. It makes no sense. It doesn't add up. Carrying on with this article in the Telegraph, both babies had suffered from blood sugar problems before the catastrophic falls. Yeah, so these were babies that were having problems with blood sugar anyway. And I think at least one of them had been having insulin. Here we are. Here it goes on to say, just a few hours after birth, baby F had high blood sugar and was prescribed insulin. Baby L's blood sugar was found to be low in the hours after his birth, and he needed treatment in the opposite way with a sugar infusion. So their sugar levels were all over the place, really. Anyway, as a matter of, and at least certainly one of them was one of the babies, baby F, was prescribed insulin. Some people are still under the impression here that these babies were murdered. They ended up as charges of attempted murder, but they weren't harmed in any way. It wasn't even deemed a crash or a sudden deterioration. They had some struggle to deal with the fluctuating glucose levels in the babies, but there were no symptoms, and one of the babies left the next day, and the other one very shortly afterwards. And now they're young children. They're out there now. Obviously, I don't know, what would it be? 8-year-old children, perfectly fine. Quite a few people in social media world and even in the world in general believe that Lucy Letby murdered babies with insulin. That's the level of misunderstanding here quite often. And yet these are the cases that we've got to keep remembering. This is the locomotive. This is the locomotive without which the wagons of the air embolism cases and so-called and alleged trauma and alleged overfeeding and pushing air down the nasogastric tube and other things like this, damage to the liver without leaving any external marks on the baby's body that the pathologist could see, because that wasn't on the autopsy. So all those are the wagons that are clearly falling apart anyway in front of your eyes, and have been since the beginning. Just to mention, earlier on, I was doing them as Dr. Scott McLachlan was doing his Substack articles about, and I've still got a few to catch up on that he's done recently, actually. He's done a few recently. I have still got to read them. I think like 23 and 24, so he's done up to like 24 articles on this. But he was doing them last year, and he was looking into the so-called insulin cases there in great detail, which I did videos about at the time. Okay, so I've read that. Okay. When the tests were returned for baby L, insulin levels. This is, and I'll go back to yet another article later in this video. When the tests were returned for baby L, insulin levels were at the top of the scale that the equipment was capable of measuring, because it wasn't the right test for exogenous at all. It should have been done at a separate laboratory somewhere else. A forensic laboratory, it was done at the, instead it was done at the clinical lab of the Royal Liverpool University Hospital, and there's not appropriate to test for when people are suspicious of synthetic insulin poisoning. Just not appropriate, not suitable at all, not the right test done, not reliable. So I'll read that again. When the tests were returned for baby L, insulin levels were at the top of the scale that the equipment was capable of measuring, around 10 to 70 times higher than in a premature baby. But both babies survived. I'll read another article in a minute where we'll go into that a bit more in more detail. Both babies survived, and initially there was no suspicion of foul play. Well, no, there wasn't even a suspicion that it was a crash and deterioration in health. We know that because the notes were never sent to Evans, these two. They were found by Breary when he was trawling for something, looking for a locomotive to get the other wagons rolling. No suspicion of foul play. Well, they didn't even follow up the blood tests. That's how much of a lack of suspicion there was. They didn't even follow up the blood tests. Didn't flag anybody's notice up, and the babies were discharged. So the tests were not checked at a proper forensic lab, indeed, and now the blood samples are gone, and we can't retest them. That's the unfortunate thing. I thought earlier on, I think that just makes it unfair because it stops the defence fairly testing the blood samples using the correct tests, which I think are so-called spectrometry tests, colour spectrometry, which not only would be able to test whether there was or was not exogenous or synthetic insulin given. It would actually even be able to tell you the brand of insulin. And this is down to different brands having slightly different changes in the string of molecules that make up this synthetic insulin. I don't know all that firsthand. I've read all that from Dr. Scott McLachlan's Substacks. His link will be below, and you can see all his Substacks with regard to that. So that's from Dr. Scott McLachlan on the Law Health Tech website. So they could have accessed these tests at that time, back in 2015 and 2016, and found out very explicitly whether or not, and they should have followed them up. They had a duty to follow them up, but they didn't bother because they didn't see it as a big deal, didn't even see it as a crash at the time, let alone thinking about foul play. It didn't cause a blip on their radar. They just found it afterwards in order to bolt on to all these other absurd accusations and lies. Accusations and lies. Both babies survived. They did more than survive. There was no symptoms in one of them, and the other one stabilised, and they were both home within a couple of days. And initially there was no suspicion of foul play, so the tests were not checked at a proper forensic lab, i.e. with that colour spectrometry test, but instead carried out at a clinical lab of the Royal Liverpool University Hospital, and they did a thing there called an immunoassay, which is just simply not suitable. And it actually says in the documentation of the Royal Liverpool University Hospital, of their lab, if you suspect synthetic or exogenous insulin poisoning, you need to, our lab can't do it. We haven't got the testing equipment here. You've got to send it to a forensic lab to have this colour spectrometry done, or this range of spectrometry testing done. So they couldn't do it at the Royal Liverpool University Hospital. Should have gone to a forensic lab. Too late now. Blood samples aren't there anymore. An NHS guidance note. Here we go. I keep preempting it. An NHS guidance note from the Liverpool lab warns that such testing cannot be used to infer if insulin has been administered artificially. They're telling you it like that. This came up at the trial, and Benjamin Myers, the defence KC, said to the representative of the lab, or the person that was the expert of the prosecution panel of experts that was related to this, called I'm trying to think of her first name, but her surname was Milan. And he said, well, what about this then? That these tests aren't, what does it say here? Such testing cannot be used. And I can't remember if I used to know all their names off by heart, but anyway, Milan, the prosecution witness said, that's just advisory. That was her answer. That was her answer last year. That's just advisory. It's literally in the documentation that they cannot be used. And that's just advisory. Can you see how they just dodge it? That's not fair, is it? I mean, come on. Does that not show that witness is not impartial, as they should be? In other words, they're supposed to hold to a standard of behaviour in which they would give expert witness testimony, irrespective of whether they're appearing for the prosecution or defence. But what she's obviously doing there is saying, oh God, I've got to save this one now. I've got to save the team here, haven't I? Oh, it's not advisory. It's not advisory. In other words, you don't need to do it, even though they're just literally telling you. The lab itself is telling you in its documentation you need to do it. And then she goes, oh, it's just advisory. Oh, you can do it, which means what? You can do it if you want. Oh, if you feel like it. Oh, if there's a W in the day. It's bizarre, isn't it? Utterly bizarre. Here we are. There's a quote here of the guidance. If exogenous insulin, this is from the Royal Liverpool University Hospital where those immunoassay tests were done. If exogenous insulin administration is suspected as the cause of hypoglycemia, please inform the laboratory so that the sample can be referred externally for analysis. The guidance reads. Very, very clear. Does that sound advisory, or does that sound like something you've got to do? Sounds like what you've got to do, isn't it, really? It's not like, do it if you feel like it. The samples were never checked by forensic experts, and the defence were not able to retest the blood, as it has since been disposed of. Very, very handily for the prosecution and the police, isn't it? And yet it's taken as gospel, but you can't test it. You haven't got a chance. You haven't got a fair chance to test it. Dr. Charlene Bottinelli, an insulin expert from the Laboratoire LAT Lumtox in France, said, that was a mouthful. So anyway, this expert, specific insulin expert, says, techniques generally performed at hospital for insulin research are immunoassays, as I was saying. These techniques allow the detection of very low insulin concentration. She goes on to say, Dr. Charlene, however, it does not allow us to formally identify the type of insulin and to distinguish human insulin from synthetic analogues. You can't tell with the immunoassays that they did whether it's apparently a synthetic or human-produced, human insulin, as she calls it. You can't tell it from the synthetic analogues. She added, quote, a high level of insulin in blood could suggest exogenous, i.e. outside administration, in other words, synthetic insulin, but also disease such as insulinoma. So it could be a disease process as well. In the case of baby L, the prosecution said the insulin readings were grossly abnormal, that's a quote, yet by the time the tests were returned, the infant had recovered. We've got more to say about that in a minute when I go to a different article. Dr. Bottinelli said levels of insulin recorded were so high, this makes the point here as well, for baby L, the insulin recorded was so high for baby L that it was highly probable that severe hypoglycemia and dramatic consequences would have been expected. I think she's sort of choosing her words carefully there. She says the likelihood the baby would have died. The baby would have died. It would have killed, put an adult in a coma. The baby would have died, but the baby's gone home the next day. So there we are. I'm going to pause it for a minute. I'm going to go and find another article that I've been looking at. Before I find the other article I've been looking at, well, I found it, but I just want to go to this tweet that Dr. Michael McConville tweeted on the 23rd. That's yesterday. He's done a lot of stuff. What he's going through every baby in terms of all the medical evidence, and he started doing a series of podcasts with just him in it. Dr. McConville is the doctor who's got 40 years experience, and he's the one that's been doing podcasts with Peter Elston, and they've done up to well over 20 podcasts in the series called We Need to Talk About Lucy Letby, which I'll tweet below. I don't know why I'm pointing upwards. I'll tweet them below. And he's also recently started doing individual podcasts. I'll also put a link for those below as well. I haven't heard those as yet. I've got to catch up with those. He started doing those, and and he's breaking down the medical information and all the mistakes that the prosecution have made in terms of assessing the medical, and the police stroke prosecution have made in terms of, and Evans obviously, in terms of each of the babies in turn. So that's going to be very interesting to listen to, and he's going in incredible detail with it. He'd done already quite a bit of that in the We Need to Talk About Lucy Letby podcast, but he's going to do that in a much more, he's going to basically go from baby A up to all through all the babies on the indictment, really, and look at all the information that is out there, and challenge everything that obviously Evans, all the nonsense, fake science and fake medicine that Evans has somehow managed to pull the wool over everyone's eyes, but not for much longer. And there's lots of other people questioning him as well. It's so much is happening right now. There's another article by a KC, a barrister, in Unheard, on the Unheard website. And there's more and more stuff coming all the time. I believe a Channel 5 documentary is coming out on the 5th of August. I don't have a television, so I'm not sure how I'm going to watch that, but that's due to be coming out as well. And other documentaries in the works, I believe. Anyway, there's this tweet that Dr. McConville put out yesterday, and he's talking about a line in a report in the Independent from a while back, and it says here, quote, but in August 2015 and April 2016, 2 separate blood test results revealed newborns had high levels of manufactured insulin in their system. So that's the quote from the Independent. That's the assertion. Dr. McConville says in his tweet, no, they didn't. No, they didn't. The test used was the Roche-Elexis immunoassay, which only tests for antibodies to human insulin. It doesn't test for insulin. It tests for antibodies to human insulin. So Dr. McConville goes on to say in his tweet, it doesn't measure insulin, and it doesn't measure manufactured insulin. It doesn't measure insulin at all. And nice barbed comment from Dr. McConville. He says at the end, apart from that, the sentence is correct. So that's the level of misunderstanding that's going out on in the media. I'm not sure what the date of that independent report he refers to, but irrespective of when it was written, that's the disjunction of misunderstanding that there is out there still, I think. I'm going to just have a look for this other article now. I have it now in front of me. It's from Science on Trial. It's a fantastic article that's been put out today, just came out today. Or was it yesterday? It might have been yesterday. Yes, I think it was yesterday, sorry. On Science on Trial, written by Sarita Adams, PhD, and Science on Trial, who's been there right from the beginning, really, trying to get justice for Lucy Letby. And there's a lot of... I'll put the link below for this particular article, and you'll be able to see other articles there on the Science and Trial website. In this article, which is titled New Precedents Reviewing the COA, that's the Court of Appeal judgment in the case of Lucy Letby, Sarita Adams, the Science on Trial article, goes through all the different elements here. And I'm just going to look at, for this video that I'm doing now, just look at the insulin case section. So there's a section here called Insulin Cases. This was written yesterday, came out yesterday. I'll read it as follows. Insulin binding to its receptor causes massive shifts in potassium and sodium. If a baby has an insulin concentration of 4,657 p-mol per litre, I believe that stands for picomol per litre, for 17 hours straight, and clearly Sarita Adams is referring to baby L here, and this concentration is maintained due to infusion of artificial insulin, then this baby would not be alive. Goes back to the statement we were talking about earlier, and that French insulin expert kind of said it it would be very dramatic, she said. She didn't say it in as bold a way as Sarita Adams is here, but other people have said this. This is what's so bizarre to me, that if that is the case, and why nobody's saying it isn't the case, how has this got through? How has it managed to get through that those blood tests are reliable in any way whatsoever? With that amount of concentration that would kill an adult in all likelihood, certainly put an adult in a coma. But the baby went home the next day, no symptoms. Went home the next day with no symptoms. There was fluctuation in the levels on the day. They got that under control. Didn't even register a crash for the Countess of Chester Hospital. Didn't even register that. Nobody followed up the blood tests. Nobody was worried about it. And yet these so-called blood tests, which, there all kinds of things could have gone wrong with those in terms of the preparation of the blood samples and how they were dealt with at the laboratory in Liverpool, and what state they were left in before they left the Countess of Chester Hospital. Were they properly prepared? Were they properly stored? Did something happen in transit, or at the other side? And again, we've got to keep saying it wasn't the correct test to establish exogenous or synthetic insulin as well. We've got to keep saying that as well. But this is a really important point, that baby L, I know Sarita Adams specifically not mentioning the name of the baby, but she's saying if a baby had that insulin concentration in their system, 4,657 picomol per litre for 17 hours straight, the baby wouldn't be alive. How is it possible that this has got through a 10-month trial? I don't know whether Benjamin Myers asked about that level's so high that it would have killed an adult. How are you explaining that? I don't think that came up, did it? Did that come up? Did he ask the so-called experts of the prosecution that are meant to be honest? Did he ask them? How come the baby just didn't seem to have anything very serious wrong with it at all and just left the hospital and discharged to its parents the next day? Baby L in this case, with a concentration of insulin that would have killed an adult. And yet we're told to believe that these are the smoking gun cases. This is the locomotive that pulls all the wagons of all the other made-up stuff. that Evans made up out of whole cloth with his own science and with his own independent medical stuff, which contradicts this. And this is what Dr. Michael McConville's doing. He's taking it apart bit by bit, everything that all of Evans's assertions. I want to get through this before an hour in case my video shuts off. So the baby would not be alive. The amount of insulin in the blood would literally cause the potassium concentration in the blood. This is back to Science on Trial article. I'll link it below. Change the potassium concentration in the blood to change to such an extent that the infant would have died fairly quickly from cardiovascular collapse. In a rare case of suicide by intravenous insulin administration, a 30-year-old woman administered a maximum of 600 IU, so there must be something units, of insulin units, IU, insulin via an intravenous cannula, which resulted in death. So, way less for an adult, it killed her. And we've got here 4657. I'm assuming that I'm not sure about those. I don't understand the units being used here, but I think the suggestion is here. I'll read that bit again. 30-year-old woman administered a maximum of 600 IU of insulin via an intravenous cannula, which resulted in death based on prior calculations. To maintain a blood insulin concentration of 4657, which was that second baby L, picomole per litre, as recorded in one of the insulin cases, it would require an infusion rate of insulin of 43 IU per hour. 43 IU per hour, and it's been happening over a 17-hour period. So just do the math. It's killed this 30-year-old woman, but it's left the baby, the second baby here of the so-called second insulin case, smoking gun cases, relatively well unharmed. They were discharged the next day, as it said in the other article, with no symptoms. Don't make sense, does it? Doesn't make sense. So it kills a 30-year-old woman, but anyway, I keep repeating it. Don't need to repeat it anymore. In essence, by the end of the 17-hour period, the baby would have received over the same amount as that which resulted in the following conditions. And there's a quote here about that 30-year-old patient. On admission, her pulse and blood pressure were not recordable. No respiratory effort was noted. Froth was coming from the nose and mouth. There's a quote here of the reference, Behira et al. 2015. So it was a case that was noted in this suicide case of a 30-year-old woman. That's what it would have resulted in, a 30-year-old woman. But the baby has no symptoms and goes home the next day with the parents. So there we are, 53 minutes now. I think that's all I want to say for this video. I didn't think it would take this long to say all that, but I just wanted to get those three articles in conjunction and flip between them. And I'm going to carry on reading through the rest of the New Yorker article. But I thought that was extraordinary. But this third insulin case, it as Michael Hall says, it's just very disturbing. It's very disturbing, isn't it? So you can get a locomotive, you can create a locomotive to put all the other cases along for two of them. If you find a third one, it's got to disappear. The police have to make it disappear. The police make it disappear. Before I forget, there's one thing I wanted to start this video with, which goes back to the previous videos I've made, is that in these 25 cases of suspicious events leading to, we assume, crashes, I don't think deaths, in the second batch of 28 sets of notes that Evans has sent in 2018, he chooses 25 that are suspicious. None of them are followed up. On what basis are they suspicious? Are they to do with the same mechanisms of intended harm, i.e. air embolism, deliberate trauma to the child, forcing air down the nasogastric tube to stop the child breathing, which apparently is impossible, but that's another story. We've got to cover that, and other people are looking into that now in great detail. for overfeeding the baby so the baby ends up not being able to breathe. That's also thought was an impossible thing to do. So, he's noted that one of those 25 is this mysterious third insulin case that never gets followed up by the police. Well, for whatever reason, it's damning. It's damning of all of it, isn't it? That alone. But I'm wondering, of all these other 24 of those 25 that he chooses from the second batch, he's got to be choosing. He's not going to start making up a whole new set of methods of attack, is he? What are they? Are they 24 further removals, alleged removals, sinister removals of breathing tubes? Is that what they are? Are there some alleged air embolism cases in there? Is there some deliberate trauma in there? Is there more nasogastric forcing of air, or injecting air into the veins, or what is that? What is there that can be dismissed so easily by the police? So if there are air embolism so-called cases in those 25 that are missed, what makes the difference between those in that 25 than the ones that end up on the indictment? I keep saying it. What makes the difference? How are they able to be just thrown away? What is it? Is it just simply that Lucy Letby is not on duty? If she's not on duty, then it's revealing clearly that Evans is completely 100% unreliable, isn't it? Because he's finding similar things in other so-called suspicious events that simply can't be substantiated in any way, but they can in other cases. Why is that? I hope I'm making sense there. It just doesn't make any sense at all. He must have said something. He didn't say, they're suspicious. He said, well, they're suspicious because of these reasons, for similar reasons as he did for the 15 out of 33 that he was sent originally in 2017. And they accepted all those, accepted every one of them. And then the next batch, they reject them all. It's utterly bizarre and weird. And clearly the most horrendous miscarriage of justice and the most horrendous corruption from the police here, and Evans and the NHS as a trio of corrupt actors, bad actors in the police, in the NHS, stroke consultants. So it starts with the consultants, then it consolidates into the trust as a whole, going in for the kill for Lucy Letby, and that's what they're doing. And of course, Evans and the prosecution thereafter. So that's the trio. Disaster. I'll leave it there. I've come to the end now of that bit. I didn't do much of the Rachel Aviv article, but there was a lot of other reference points here in relation to these so-called insulin cases. They're going to be picked over more and more and more and more. And they are being, it's falling apart. There's going to be justice here. There's going to be an overturning. The system don't like it, don't want it. The establishment doesn't want it, but it's going to be forced to do it. It's going to be forced to overturn this miscarriage of justice. It's going to happen. The momentum now is too strong, and it's happened so quickly after the convictions that it's so intensely strong now. So I feel very, very hopeful that it's going to come right in the end after the terrible, wicked thing they've done to this poor, innocent person, and how they've misled all those parents. But anyway, it's going in the right direction now for the truth to come out and for justice to be done. Thank you for listening if you have. All the best. Take care. Bye-bye.